got a GTX 1070 and I'm waiting on a 380. And here I am playing a game from 1993 or something. Oh no, I'm going through play old games. Going through like a play old games phase.
BBC Radio 4, and now the former Central European correspondent Misha Glenny, having explored the origins of Germany, Italy and Spain for us, takes a trip across the Atlantic to explore the invention of Brazil.
This is a story that begins with the sea. In June 1494, emissaries of the great monarchies of Portugal and Spain met in a small Iberian town to agree on how to divide the globe. They drew a line, north to south, from pole to pole, and to the west of this line, the Spanish, they agreed, would forever have exclusive right to all newly discovered and undiscovered land. To the east, and that came to include the stretch of coastline where I am now, the Portuguese could take what they found. And this papally approved global division led directly to the invention of Brazil. We're in a very small bus called a van, and we're going through one of the very richest parts of Rio, Gavia. But the next place we'll come to after Gavia is called Rocinha. It's the largest slum in South America, and it is, of course, one of the very poorest parts of Rio, and they're slap bang next to each other. For a couple of months now, I've been living in a favela in Rio de Janeiro called Rocinha, all part of my research for a book about the new Brazil. But in these programs, you'll hear where the new Brazil came from. Lots of police here in Rocinha because it's a pacified favela. And before they came, this place was very, very violent, but they're pretty intimidating themselves, big guns and big swagger. And that reflects another thing about Brazilian history: violence. Today, some 200 million Brazilians speak Portuguese, legacy of that treaty agreed by the Pope. But what else defines this great landmass? And why, in this age of emerging economies and the BRIC acronym, do we British still know so little about Brazil? That's something I hope we can change.
Okay, my name is João Reis. That's how I want to be described. As a professor of history at the Federal University of Bahia.
Can you start by telling us generally, when did slavery begin and why did it happen?
The first important importations came in the mid-16th century to work in the cane fields.
And they started importing slaves in very significant numbers, is that right?
Oh yes, Brazil is the largest black country outside Africa. If we take the 400 years of slave trade, Brazil was the largest importer to the Americas. There were many Africans, by the way, who served as interpreters, for example, who could tell the slaves, you're not going to be eaten by those whites. And that was Africans' fear that whites were bringing them to an unknown world where they would be eaten.
As I said earlier, this is a story that begins with the sea, a country created largely by people who arrived from elsewhere. Take the anthropologist Peter Fry.
I came by boat, and the boat sailed into the Bay of Guanabara at night, can you imagine? And that little Santos Dumont airport with the little turboprops taking off and landing, and Christ overviewing everything lit up as well. I thought it was the most beautiful place I'd ever been.
Let's talk a bit about the Brazilians. Who are the Brazilians? Where do they come from?
Well, there are three races. They call them races. People from Africa, the slaves who were brought against their will. The Indians who were already here when the Portuguese first arrived. The Portuguese themselves, and then lots of other Europeans. And then later, at the end of the 19th century, Germans, and then later on, Italians, and then later on still, Japanese. And if you stop on any corner and just watch the people go past, you can see facial expressions and colors of people and hairs of people that remind you of all over the world, which is why the Brazilian passport is the most valuable, you know that. You can look like anything and be Brazilian.
Have you got a Brazilian passport?
Yes, I do have a Brazilian passport.
So looking out of the window of my favela, I can see it's quite steep all along the hillside. There are these tiny higgledy-piggledy houses, most of them with makeshift water tanks on the top. And then beyond them, there are high-rise buildings, much richer district there. And then beyond the high-rise buildings, the beach, the sea. The one thing you can't get away from here is the noise. Endless racket going on. I, in particular, hate the dogs.
Colour and money, they're almost synonymous, aren't they? The richer you are, the paler you become. Poorer you are, the darker you become. And that's pretty much a general rule. And every time you find somebody who's very, very black and very, very wealthy, that's the exception that proves the rule. But not the other way around. So you find lots of people, pale people, who are quite poor in Brazil. Quite a lot. And even in this favela, what you were just saying, it gets blacker the further you go up, because these are the guys who live in the less salubrious part of the place. I mean, obviously, it's more convenient to be down near the main road.
Yes, even in the favela, you see this differentiation reflected in class, and it's reflected in money, because the other thing about down there, as we'll see when we go down there, is the businesses are much livelier, and they're better stocked, and they've got more customers. But as you said, you do get quite a lot of white people in the favelas as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are quite a few white people in Rocinha here.
Right.
What we haven't done yet is explain how Brazil began, or at least how Brazilians believe their country began, when the Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral landed on this continent and claimed it for his king. Dr. Luciana Martins at Birkbeck College told me more.
Well, we were taught that that's where history starts, being discovered and the first contact with indigenous groups. And of course there were some problems and there was some resistance, but it was all seen as the advance of the civilization, really. You know, we are being colonized, and that's a good thing.
And did they teach, when they were talking about the contacts with the indigenous groups for the first time, were you taught it in this sort of romanticised way about how the Portuguese loved the indigenous people and how the indigenous people loved the Portuguese, and it was all a big happy family?
It was very much so, yeah. You know, it was all very harmonic. And secondary school, I remember, then we started having teachers who were more critical and started opening our eyes to the violence of the whole process. Also, there was some kind of regret that we weren't discovered by the British, you know, because the Portuguese legacy wasn't so good, you know. So there was something about, wow, if you were discovered by the British, you would be the United States now, you know, it wouldn't be...
That's interesting. That was something that you would discuss at primary school or at secondary school, that wouldn't it have been great if the Brits had discovered us?
It wasn't taken very seriously, but it was in the mind of people, you know. People would say, wow, you know, our disgrace of this country is because, you know, we were colonized by Portuguese.
Atenção, cuidado com o vão no embarque e desembarque. Obrigado. Attention, mind the gap. Thank you.
The Portuguese landed on the coast of Brazil, we are told, on April the 22nd, 1500. Now, as I prepare to take this cable car up to the top of Sugarloaf Mountain, let me leave you in the safe hands of David Brookshaw, Emeritus Professor of History and well-known Brazilianist.
When they first arrive, they don't really know what they want. It was a fleet that was bound for India, and of course the sailing ships had to sail in a wide arc out into the Atlantic to pick up favourable winds to then take them across to the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean. So it's quite conceivable that Brazil was somehow fallen upon by mistake. And they do what the Portuguese quite often do, is they leave a few sailors behind who either die or are killed or take up with local women. Women settlers were very few in number, so much so that sometimes the king had to empty the orphanages and offer colonials a kind of bride with a dowry.
Looking down from on top of Sugarloaf Mountain, you can see the obvious reason why people were attracted here. Guanabara Bay, a fantastic natural harbour. But if I move around to the left a little, what do I see? I see thick, dense, lush forest, mountains. And had I been here in the 15th or 16th century, the other thing I would have seen would have been swamps everywhere. So, whilst this was very exciting to arrive in, people didn't want to go into the interior because, frankly, the natural obstacles were just impossible to overcome. So they stayed here, by the beaches.
Well, Portugal's population was very small. It meant that there was a problem of manpower, really.
Tiny Portugal and giant Brazil. It's a compelling tale, and an enduring theme is the way the colonizers have been outgrown.
The Portuguese have always been a kind of jokes. I mean, I remember the first time I went to Portugal, I couldn't stop laughing in the taxi, because the radio was on. Just the way of speaking, for us, it's a kind of prejudice, really, I think.
And yet, one of the things I wanted to ask you about what makes a Brazilian. How central to the Brazilian identity is the Portuguese language?
I think people are proud of not speaking Spanish. It makes us different from the rest.
So this is great. We're halfway up a very steep hill, and there are lots of large vehicles, buses, there are rubbish carts, there are lorries, and everything's come to a grinding halt. But what's really interesting about it is that people don't seem to bother that much. They're so used to this sort of thing happening. The chaos is really built into their lives. Oh, I think we might be moving now. Yes, we are.
The question one has to ask is, how can this minute country with this tiny, tiny group of people manage to create a society which is more or less viable?
The anthropologist Peter Fry.
Portuguese expansion was a very cruel expansion into the hinterland of the country, and bringing with them diseases and guns. And most of them on the coast, most of the Indian people were rapidly assimilated into Brazilian ways of life, losing their languages, losing their culture in effect. But the Brazilians have a wonderful expression, which is soprar e morder. How do you say that? Bite and then...
Spit.
No.
Chew.
No.
Whistle.
Blow. You produce a wound and then you blow over it to take away the sting. So you had brutality and violence coupled with attempts at living together and sleeping together. So the biggest difference between the Portuguese and the Brits is that the children that were born of affairs between the Portuguese, usually males, and local ladies, were assimilated in Brazilian culture, so they were brought up to speak Portuguese. Whereas, of course, in the British Empire, the contrary. I mean, people who were the sons and daughters of relationships between the Brits and the local ladies were segregated. I mean, I can remember this in what was then Southern Rhodesia. I mean, there were coloured areas of the town. The difference was that here, the kids were drawn into society and not expelled from society. And I think that's what makes not just Brazil, but other places where the Portuguese went rather different. And so, more than any other country that I know, has been this process of assimilation into a common culture.
I'm leaving Rio now, lovely Rio, where it hasn't stopped raining since we started recording this programme, and we're off to the airport to take a plane to Salvador, some 1,200 kilometres north of here. Now, Salvador was the first capital of Brazil, and for centuries the most important city and port on the Atlantic south of the equator. And it's probably raining there too. David Brookshaw again.
There comes a point in the mid-16th century when they decide to try and formalise their presence along the coast of Brazil, partly because of real threat from France, for example, who are sailing down the coast of Brazil at the same time, not England at this stage. So they decide to establish a colonial capital in Bahia, which is now Salvador, in 1549. And slowly, planters who had been planting sugar in the Atlantic islands, Madeira, São Tomé, begin to introduce sugarcane into the northeastern coastal belt. The northeast becomes a little bit like the old south of the United States. It's where the plantation economy begins.
This is João Reis, a world expert on this terrible trade.
Most slaves coming to Salvador were brought from the so-called slave coast, which is the littoral of Benin. To Rio, the majority of slaves were brought from what today is Angola.
And at this time, Salvador was the capital of Brazil.
Salvador was the capital of Brazil until 1763.
So, up to 6 million slaves were brought here?
Almost 6 million slaves.
Yeah, which is an extraordinary number of people.
Oh, yes, it is.